think we're live, right?
Yep, looks like
Yes,
we're
we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're going to be chatting and talking about maximizing growth and profitability with the right platform and the right merchant of record. In the coming 45 minutes, we're going to be discussing on practical ways to expand internationally without sacrificing profitability. And we hope that by the end of the session, you will know a little bit about an e-commerce platform that enables multi-market expansion, what a merchant of record actually does and what it means to your business, and what is that you need to know so you can expand confidently. I'm Danny Viniegra, Chief Partnerships Officer at ExpandNow. We are a Europe-based merchant of record that helps brands simplify the process of selling internationally, and I will be moderating the session along with Jason Nyhus, President GM at Shopware North America. Jason and his team are doing a fantastic job helping brands launch and scale multi-market e-commerce. And then also Dan Breuer, our CCO at ExpandNow. Feel free anytime to the audience, feel free anytime to send us any questions in the chat. We will be discussing them live at the end of the session in a live Q&A. This session is going to be recorded, so you will be receiving a message in your email with a registration. And now let's start. Let's start talking about the opportunity and the friction teams often feel when they add new countries into their business. Let's talk about the opportunity and why now. Jason, on the Shopware side and perhaps in the e-commerce industry in general, what are you seeing from brands expanding internationally right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, every company we know is either trying to grow or to find ways to be more efficient. And as it relates to growth, one of the top 2 to 3 ways to grow your revenue is to find new buyers. And so international expansion is always in the top 1 to 2 conversations with every merchant that we work with. And so trying to figure out how to reach new markets, reach new customers, and do so in an efficient way is, like I said, a top 3 priority for every merchant.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, and one of the ways I actually love to frame it up, Jason, is if you just kind of step back and try to size whether or not this should be a priority for brands. I love to look at the data points for retail commerce, digital commerce, and cross-border commerce. For me, it tells like this incredibly clear story. And I don't have last year on hand, but if you just look at like the past decade, retail commerce is typically like flat to up 5%, digital commerce up 5 to 10%. And then depending on how you define cross-border digital commerce, it's usually anywhere from 2 to 4 times faster growing than digital commerce in general, right? So obviously most brands care about digital commerce, but this question around should you care about cross-border digital commerce, the data seems to suggest that like there's a real nice tailwind there for a lot of brands. And I think so much of that has to do with the fact that it's just getting easier to buy from a brand in another country. You have brands now that are relevant all over the world, as opposed to the olden days where they were just kind of relevant in their local market through retailers. So I think the landscape definitely paints like this really clear picture that it should be a top 5 priority for brands who have products that have appeal outside of their main market.
I think you hit a big point. Let me add on to that. Kind of gone are the days that where you have to build a brand and you have to do it through traditional retail. With the advent of TikTok a few years ago, with Instagram, with all these places for people to build brands, they can reach audiences they historically have not been able to reach. And so I do think that is one of the tailwinds that's driving the cross-border internationalization as part of the growth strategy.
Yeah. When you talk to brands about this, Jason, or they raise it with you and say, hey, this is a top 5 priority for 2026.
Yep.
Can you help me? Are they usually coming to you with a wealth of knowledge, a plan in place, like just ready to execute? Or are they coming to you with, I see this as a really big opportunity, but I have no idea where to start and I'm not sure how to execute? I'm sure it's some flavor of both, but can you just give us a sense for like how prepared brands seem to be to take advantage of this?
Yeah, it's always a mix, and it always depends on, the brand and the reach and all of those things. But if I were to genericize it a little bit, I would say the first thing that people come in with is a strong bias towards trying to use what they already have in place. Okay, so they have a commerce system. How do I expand it? They have a payments engine. How do I expand it? They have a tax system, an entity structure, a fraud system, and their initial goal will say, how do I take everything I have and serve UK, Germany, France, Japan, whatever. So that's their initial instinct. And it almost has to be a conversation around, well, this is what happens if you do that. And it comes to a conversation around, you're exposing yourself to different risks across fraud, across your entity structure, across the way you pay taxes. And that's when it really becomes a really educational journey around, you can't just take what's built for one market and simply try to land it in another. Something you probably can talk a lot about, with local payment methods and acceptance rates and, de minimis values, which obviously for shipping has changed. But I think there's a whole bunch of lack of understanding as to what it will actually take to open up new markets. I think the idea is there. I think the revenue forecasts are probably pretty accurate, but I think the how you get to addressing these markets is the big gap that has to be addressed.
Yeah. Usually when we first start talking to merchants, they're somewhere down the path of, I've done some research and I have an idea on how to do this, but this looks hard. Or I've tried it a little ways down the path. Like I've tried to do some of the things I need to do to sell internationally, but it's just too painful and I don't have the time and resource. And it's funny, just about everybody I talk to, and there's a varying degree of experience. If you talk to a large enterprise company, they're very well prepared to do these things. If you talk to a mom and pop shop, not prepared at all to do these things. But the ones who do come to us and sort of need help to start selling internationally, it usually revolves around like two big themes for us. Right? One of them is tax is really hard, and I don't mean to just like narrow in on tax, but tax can be really hard for a lot of brands and for different reasons. One reason I see a lot is companies who don't traditionally sell direct to end customer as their main channel. They sell to retailers and resellers and distributors, and that's 99% of their business. So for this next, 1% of your business, or what might ultimately be less than 10% of your business, you have this entirely different way of thinking about tax, right? Tax becomes so much more complicated for that part of your business. As well as you have all these tax regulations, and I'm kind of a tax nerd, so I don't mean to go deep, but you have all these tax regulations in the last decade that put a tax obligation on non-residents, people like me based in the US who want to sell to, people like Danny based in Spain. And that is making tax way more complicated than it used to be. It used to be, where do I have a physical office? That's how you thought about tax. And then the second big theme that people usually show up with is just like the collective amount of complexity of trying to make all these different point solutions come together. The collective amount of complexity, the aggregate pain it creates when they have to make their payment solution, fraud solution, tax solution work together in this new use case that it hasn't worked in previously, right? That aggregate amount of pain, can be really challenging. A good way to think about this is, we're in this environment now where if you're using something like Shopware or some other commerce platform, if you have a need, like you typically first go look for an app, you know, an extension to that commerce platform. And over time, you accumulate lots of them. And one of the things I've learned in this space is they don't always work perfectly well together. They don't always all address the exact same use cases. So that aggregate complexity that gets created when you start adding the next market and the next market and the next market tends to be a kind of an overarching theme.
Let me pile onto that a little bit, because I just to contextualize it, if you have a $100 million merchant doing business in, say, the United States, and they want to add a bundle of countries, in aggregate, those 5 to 6 countries might be worth an additional 5% of their business. Well, when you operate at scale, $100 million, and you have a team of accountants, and you've hired a lawyer, and you have a team to support a $100 million business, now you need to do the same amount of business processes to support something that is roughly 5% of the same market. And so just that sheer math on all the things we've done to support our backyard to do business in someone else's is a complexifier. And the capacity and the scale to support it kind of goes away, which is exactly why the merchant of record model exists in the first place, is because it gives you the economic benefit of the entire provider, as opposed to just you doing it as a one-off in these 5 countries. Is that what you're seeing as well? And people realizing that the math kind of breaks on the ability to support it?
Yeah, I think that's right on. It was something I was going to comment on later, but just about every time you take on a new project, some new initiative, there's always an upfront cost. And it just so happens that selling in a new market oftentimes has an upfront cost that's kind of upside down relative to the opportunity. I haven't talked to a lot of merchants who just say that immediately on day one, they're expecting, millions in revenue through this new market. It's usually a process, and it takes time, and it's not going to be huge immediately on day one. But to get to it, you have this big barrier, this big project between you and that opportunity, and compound that by, the next 10 markets that you want to go to. It becomes a real challenge for a lot of brands. Yeah.
Very good insights, guys. And if we go to, we were discussing on the merchant of record side, but if we go to the platform, what would you say, Jason, are the capabilities that the platform has to have that matter the most for those brands that are trying to accomplish
not all brands
success?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry about that. So not all e-commerce platforms are built to support multi-market approaches. And so there's some things to look for when you're having conversations. The first is how well you deal with things like multi-site. And it's really the ability to use a single backend and have the multiple storefronts and elegantly deal with the back office management of the moving pieces. And secondarily, what that means is the financial model. And so there are industry-leading commerce platforms that say, we can support global really well. All you have to do is create new sites, and those come with additional expense and additional overhead to manage. And so you get to the spot where you're covering, the 10 largest e-commerce markets in the world. You've got 10 different instances of some e-commerce platform. And 10 different teams with different language skills, all trying to manage it. It becomes very complicated and expensive. So what to look for is companies who do multi-site, multi-storefront very elegantly. And the software has been designed to serve global markets. And all you got to do is look for companies who kind of came out of complex markets, places in Europe that are really, really good at dealing with compliance and all of the regulatory things in the world, places like Latin America, where you need to kind of serve a group of markets to do well, things like that. The other complexity around this concept of multi-storefront is how your e-commerce platform elegantly deals with multiple providers for things like tax, multiple payment engines for things like merchant of record versus PayFac, so the ability to support multiple models. Another is the way that you deal with inventory, where the products are, how they can be shipped, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount of complexity around going global. And the platform's role in doing it is to elegantly allow you to manage both the back end and the front end without having to pay significantly more to do so. So that is what I would look for as commerce platforms. And then obviously having the right provider around payments, fraud, tax, compliance is mission critical, which is obviously where ExpandNow comes in.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I love talking to Jason about this stuff is, in a lot of ways, like, we each solve about half the problem for merchants who want to sell international. Shopware does a really nice job solving the problem of creating a logical shopping experience, managing your business, your product catalog, et cetera, across lots of different countries. And those are all critical to getting started. And a company like ExpandNow can help you with the things that are behind that, the other half of the problem that you ultimately have to solve. One of the litmus tests I always tell people to think about when they're evaluating the path they're about to go down is the solution you're putting in place something you can clearly redeploy over and over again, for the next round of markets? Is it something you can clearly redeploy from market A to market B? Or are you at risk of going down a path of building lots of one-offs? The biggest reason for failure that I've seen in the market is you have an initiative to go sell in some new market, and you go scope it and you go build the capability to sell in that market. But what you've built doesn't think about how you're going to go from market A to market B. Market B becomes a new motion. The project with the same level of effort as market A was, right? So I think brands got to step back and apply this test. Is what I'm building, is the path I'm going down, something I can easily redeploy to my next round of markets? Because usually if you're a brand who is expanding into one market, it's likely because you have demand in lots of markets, and you're just starting the journey of going down that path and taking advantage of that opportunity. So if everyone looks like the investment of the first one, you're going to get yourself into a bit of a pinch.
Totally agree. Good said. And Jason, if you were talking now to a brand, they need to launch new countries. Which countries would you recommend? Which 2 new countries would you recommend to launch this quarter, for instance? What kind of advice would you give to focus on that first?
The first thing I would start is wherever you have traffic to your website, or where you're able to gain followers or people on places like TikTok or Instagram, I would say number one is lean into the volume and traffic and interest you already have. The second point of view is go for ones that are culturally similar to where your backyard is. So if you're an American company, lean heavily into Australia, the UK, Canada, maybe parts of Latin America, and parts of Europe. But the further you go from home, the more unique things are in terms of the way you do commerce. So traffic sources and cultural will be the 2 main points around how to consider where to go next. I'm sure Dan has a better answer, but that's my take.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's certainly not one universal answer. Your product has to be relevant in whatever market you're trying to go into. You have to have some demand that's already pre-existing and bubbling up. There's a certain set of criteria like that you absolutely have to check the box on. One thing I do see that I think is kind of cool that's happening in the market right now is I see a lot of brands who use Marketplace as like the trail guide. And whether it's Amazon or some other marketplace, you kind of use Marketplace as the trail guide to where you might have a direct to consumer, a D2C channel. in the future where you can create a unique experience relative to that marketplace success. I'm curious, Jason, is that a thing on your side? Like, do you see brands who are kind of triggered by having some success in another sales channel?
Very much so. Absolutely. I don't know any better, but any of these signals that you kind of get through the way you operate your business, you should figure out if there's a way to translate it into a direct relationship with the buyer. Generally speaking, that direct relationship allows you to disintermediate other providers and hopefully then allows you to make more money and have a direct relationship for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So yes, look at marketplaces. Number one, get into marketplaces. And then number two, analyze the data to disintermediate them.
Yeah. The interesting thing about marketplaces too, and we at ExpandNow have not spent a ton of time broadly supporting brands and in all the marketplace that exists. But one area that we have invested in quite a bit is TikTok Shop, social commerce marketplaces. And I was talking to a guy who leads an agency a couple of weeks ago that we partner with quite a bit. And he was telling us a story about a consumer goods brand. And they were having a lot of success on TikTok by getting their products viral and exposing it to new customers. And that they were seeing a measurable increase in their volume in other sales channels. You know, it was very clearly a way of sort of growing direct to consumer and likely also growing retail by having all this success in this social commerce marketplace. And that might be unique to places like, TikTok and Meta. That might not be true in channels like Amazon, but I thought that was really interesting. That marketplace was kind of viewed by them as this way of growing their direct to consumer business, which seems counterintuitive on the surface, but they were clearly seeing some measurable improvement in how much visibility they had in other places. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Yep, super interesting. So if we think of dealing with the overhead of international e-commerce, and we already mentioned a few things about merchant of record from both of you, good comments. Dan, what would you say, what other things really the merchant of record actually do? We ease the complexity of the taxes, but what other things are really important on the side of the merchant of record, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, this is probably a good opportunity to just talk kind of broadly about what merchant of record is as well. I've been in this space for about 15 years, and so I'm neck deep in it. But I'm always shocked at how many times I talk to brands who didn't know this option existed, and just to see their eyes light up that there was some different way of going about global expansion is always kind of fun. The history of merchant of record, though, it's actually been around a really long time. Prior to my time at ExpandNow, I spent a number of years actually working with Jason at another company in this space, who arguably invented merchant of record 20 plus years ago. And if you go way back in your time machine, one of the industries that it had a really good fit for was actually the software industry. If you're old enough to remember going down to Circuit City and buying some software out of a box on a CD and then bringing it home and installing it, that at the time made a lot of sense, and that's how you sold software. But as digital commerce became possible, those types of companies started to think about, how can I distribute this directly over the internet, right? And those types of companies didn't have really any ability to do so. And so I would argue that was one of the first places merchant of record kind of showed up in the market 20 plus years ago to solve this direct to end customer use case in an easier way. In plain English, just what is a merchant of record for people who have never even heard of it? Think of merchant of record as a business model where you appoint someone else, another provider, to perform the role of merchant on your behalf. Right? It's exactly as it sounds. You appoint another provider to act as merchant on your behalf, all while keeping the customer experience in your branded D2C experience, right? That's the simplest way of thinking about merchant of record. It's a business model where you use a third party to be the merchant on your behalf. And you might be thinking, well, why would I do that? Why would I want to have somebody else be the merchant and not myself be the merchant? And the answer is all the complex, back office things that Jason and I have talked about already, fraud and payments and tax and compliance. By using merchant of record, you're essentially shifting that complexity to this third-party provider, right? You're taking it off your plate and putting it on their plate. And it's likely they've already just built the capability to do that really well. And so you can kind of outsource the things that are hard, the things that are just not strategic to your business at all, so that you can focus on the things that are strategic to your business, like your products and your customers and your content, right? There's actually very similar parallels to merchant of record in other industries. And the examples I always talk about, there's a lot of companies who use something called employer of record, right? Very common way of approaching payroll in a country that you don't have a presence. Same concept, hire somebody else to handle payroll and employer stuff for me. There's also a lot of logistics companies who provide importer of record as a service, right? I need to move a pallet of my product from point A to point B, and point B is in another country. You can oftentimes hire logistics companies to play that importer of record role on your behalf. Another area I've recently seen is in product compliance. If you sell beauty, cosmetics, food and beverage, categories like that, you have to meet a lot of product compliance requirements. Whether it's things like responsible person, in food and beverage, you have licenses that you have to abide by. It's very common in that industry to hire a third-party provider who performs that role on your behalf, right? So I always try to tell people this is not like unique and some obscure business model inside of e-commerce. The same type of problem is being solved in other industries. And it's just being applied to e-commerce and usually in this global expansion use case.
Dan, maybe I love your explanation. You're so good at it. The thing that I think would be helpful for the audience or the listeners is who's the ideal customer profile. And I have a bias. I think I know who it is, but I'd love to hear from you. If a merchant looks like this, they should investigate merchant of record. Who is that merchant? Size, scope, that kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, very good question. Let's start with size. Oftentimes, the large enterprise companies, big public names, like a Microsoft, for instance, oftentimes they're not really the best candidate for merchant of record. If you just step back and think about why, well, they're Microsoft. And so, they have thousands of people and endless resources. And so these challenges we've talked about are solvable, very solvable. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I usually tell people, if you're just getting started, if you're like a one-person business and, you're at the stage of like, I want to localize language, things like that, you might not also be the right candidate for merchant of record because you're probably a little early. You may not have sleepless nights about being tax compliant. You may not really be worried about, can I offer all the right payment methods? Fraud's probably not a big concern for you. And so you're probably not at the stage yet where merchant of record can really do something valuable for your business. I like to think of the perfect candidate as being in that middle space. These are mid-market companies. They likely sell 1 million or more already through e-commerce. They have products who are relevant in lots of markets. They probably have pent-up demand because their products are relevant in these markets. They have enough traction to where all you really need is to pour a little fuel on the fire and use merchant of record to go after these countries in a really strong way. So I would say size-wise, that tends to be the ideal candidate. Profile of company, I would say it's all over the board. We see lots of companies who predominantly sell through retail and other channels, and so selling direct to consumer through their e-commerce channel, it's like a foreign language, and so merchant of record can be incredibly valuable there. And on the opposite end of the experience, we see lots of brands who are used to selling direct to their end customer, maybe built their business on that basis, but they've solved the easy countries already, and the next round of countries are not so easy. They're going to require just way too much time and effort and resource and thinking to make that happen. And they don't want to do that. What they want to do is accelerate getting at the opportunity. Yeah.
Well, I think you said something very intriguing there. Sorry to keep probing Dan on these questions here, but you talked a lot about things it takes to be successful in a new market, and really stratifying what is strategic and value add for you to do versus really just tactical and required to do. Can you put more kind of texture on that around where you guys think brands should be spending their time and energy around building a business in, say, a new market versus taking time to do payments, fraud, tax, and compliance?
Yeah. Well, let's stick with the tax example that I talked about earlier, because I think that's usually the easiest for people to wrap their head around. I don't know of many instances where dealing with some new tax compliance requirement is strategic inside of the business. Just about in every case, everyone other than the CFO would say, hey, abiding by this new tax requirement because Jason wants to sell in a new country. Just about everybody other than the CFO would say that's not strategic. I would be much better suited to focus on marketing or my new product release or this campaign I'm about to roll out, right? So I always feel like tax is one of those areas that is almost never strategic for businesses to add on to their capabilities, unless there's some reason you need it in the future. Some other sales channel you're going to sell through, and you just have to have that capability. Usually not strategic. On the other end of things, if it's something related to your product or the experience on your website or your marketing, if it's something related to that and it's applicable to expanding into new markets, very strategic, not something you would usually outsource to somebody else. That's something you have a deep knowledge in. You want to have complete control over that. You want to find providers who don't take away from your ability to control those things, complement your ability. So that's how I try to divide up the lines, is if it sits in the back office and it doesn't add any value to the growth of my business and I'm not going to use it anywhere else, it's probably not strategic. Merchant of record can really help. If it's very customer facing, if it helps my business broadly, if it relates to my product, my content, my marketing, likely strategic. Likely not something you want to really outsource to somebody in this space. Yeah.
Well said, Dan. Well said. So if we put it together and we think of simple ways to start, in your opinion, Jason, what must be true at the platform level so that global expansion is repeatable? than other than an on-off project that goes on and on all the time for new each market?
Well, I think from a platform perspective, two things need to be true. I kind of talked about it before, but it's how elegantly and simply you provide, these unlimited channels. So you're not paying through the nose every time you want to add more, use more of the software. I think that's kind of point one. The second is around having a robust, open ecosystem. And so that merchants have the ability to select a product like ExpandNow and use your service as it makes sense for them, as opposed to being forced to use a certain payment provider, a certain tax provider, because of a commercial relationship the platform might have. So to me, those are the two most important things as it relates to platform considerations: is work with a platform that supports multi-everything, unlimited channels, etc. And number two, work with one that has a robust, open ecosystem. As those two things, I think the brands have the ability to get the solution they need that meets their kind of core use case. Because I think, Dan, you'd say the same. There's going to be some markets where you already have the business infrastructure, the entity, the payment relationship, the tax established, the fraud systems, that you wouldn't need a merchant record model. You'd use a payment facilitator, or you'd be your merchant yourself. And so the ability to kind of support these multiple models is a really valuable thing that shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah. I think that's really well said. The second point you made there really resonated with me, like creating an environment of apps and extensions and service providers that sit around your capability that can solve these problems for people. I'm curious, how do you view your role in that? Do you view your role as sort of orchestrating brands towards the right places within your ecosystem? Or do you view your role as just creating the biggest, broadest ecosystem possible, and brands sort of just go there to do all the discovery for the problem they're trying to solve?
It's an awesome question. And the reality of it is, Shopware's got more than 50,000 live clients all over the world. We've got hundreds of thousands of apps in our app store and plugins. We've got hundreds of agencies we work with around the globe. And so our ability to kind of play favorites goes in a way against our open ethos of being an open commerce platform. So our goal is to really provide this system that allows for these partners like ExpandNow and others to come in, build a really great app, and use the mechanisms of the App Store to promote, and then use the connections to our agencies to educate, and then use things like the star rating and the quality ratings in our system, how you move up different levels based on the adoption and the feedback of the ecosystem. So it's one that is as pure of a system as you can think of, that really allows the best providers to get the best coverage. And so we're not going into conversations saying expand now. We're going into conversations saying, hey, merchant of record is a viable option. There's 3 or 4, 5, 6 providers in our app store that can help with this. Take a look at them. And that's kind of how we do that. Our goal is to be, again, open and not let financial incentives drive people to outcomes that aren't best for them. And it's a very different approach to our competition.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're really cultivating an environment where, people can use your product better and more, and solve these difficult problems by bringing together things that work well with your product. I think that's it's a very, very thoughtful way to think about it. If I was a brand, and I was choosing a commerce platform, I'd want to have the feeling that there were the right tools sitting around it that I can use to do the things I want to do in the future.
Yeah. And then if a brand wanted to start test, let's say 2-3 new markets without making too many changes in the system that they have in place, what would you recommend? How would you recommend they approach that?
Yeah. Well, thanks for teeing that one up, Danny. That's actually, in my eyes, one of the strongest arguments for using a merchant of record solution. You know, if we just kind of step back and think about all the brands we've talked to in the past who are going through global expansion projects, whether you like it or not, it's usually a bit of a test and learn. You know, I don't talk to a ton of brands who they just know going in exactly the return on the investment they're going to get. There's usually some level of test and learn, right? And so I think one of the most important parts about choosing the right solutions to move forward with is that it's got to work in a test and learn environment. And what I really mean by that is it's got to be the case that you don't have to make a huge upfront investment to go do that test and learn. You know, if you're looking at an option and it's going to take 6+ months to implement, and at the other end of that, you have a very uncertain amount of revenue, well, that's a very difficult decision for any business to make. You know, I'm going to give up 6 months of certain investment for very uncertain revenue. So that's why I think test and learn in this global expansion world is such a critical part, and one of the best cases I think you can make for merchant of record and ExpandNow specifically. It really does give you this ability to go try out new markets, learn a little bit, figure out where to put your investment of time and money, and then really start growing from there without doing this 6-month plus project up front just to get there and see what happens. You know, I think more times than not, brands don't end up moving forward with these projects because the path to getting there, if you're a merchant yourself, is a long one. It's a complicated one, and it can cost a lot of money. And sooner or later, you just wipe your hands clean and say, I can't make that business case work. Merchant of record gives you a really nice solution to that that business case.
Yeah, and if we think in concrete ways to retain a percentage of the GMV, you know, in today's environment where we have the pressure of the margins, what are some of the specific ways ExpandNow can help the brands capture as much profitability as possible?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to take that one. And my background is actually in finance. So I think about these things in a very tactical, tangible way. You know, you see a lot of providers in the market who talk about how much growth you can get by doing things like language localization and currency localization. And many of those things are absolutely the case. If you create a shopping experience that's relevant to shoppers, then you're going to convert more shoppers, right? But I tend to think about the more tactical, behind the scenes things that you can ensure you have in place so that you're not eroding into your profitability, right? We're in this time right now where just about everybody's costs are going up. You know, I tell people all the time, my wife runs an e-commerce business. Just about every one of her costs is going up. And so I find her thinking a lot about, how do I make this next initiative that I'm pursuing more profitable? How do I squeeze cost out or get a little bit extra revenue? And I think there are some really tactical ways. One I tell people a lot is, if you're expanding into lots of new markets with lots of new currencies, be very thoughtful about foreign exchange. A lot of brands, unless you're talking directly to the CFO, this can be a really complex area. And I'll tell you, the dirty little secret in the payments industry and in some parts of merchant of record is that FX is something they can monetize quite a bit from brands. So you got to really be careful about that. You need to understand the exchange rates you're getting, and you need to understand what kind of extra fees you're paying just to convert your funds. So I think that's one big one, and one that we're focused on at ExpandNow. Another big one that people don't tend to think of as a cost, but it's really important, is cash flow. One of the downsides historically of merchant of record is that the cash flow has been quite long. I think I said before, I've been in the space about 15 years. It's usually, call it 30-day cash flow terms. So once you take an order, it's about 30 days until you actually get your cash flow. And while that may not show up on your P&L as a hard cost, there's a real financial cost to that. That was money that you could have put in to more inventory, more marketing. You could have just invested that money. There is a real cost to that. In today's economy, probably like a 50 basis point cost to that, right? And so whatever path you go down, make sure that you get paid as quick as you would get paid if you used any other payment provider. And I kind of harp on this point because it's one of the biggest problems we set out to solve for and ExpandNow is get brands daily payouts. Just like you would get if you worked with a payment provider just directly as a merchant yourself. And then lastly, I would say you got to go down a path that doesn't have a heavy upfront cost. When people are talking about profitability, they're often just thinking about their variable costs and how much do I make every time I sell one of these widgets. But really that profitability in the business case depends an awful lot on how much did you spend just to get started, right? The fixed costs that you have to overcome along the way just to make that project profitable, right? I've seen people go down paths, unfortunately, that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and, you're profitable in year 3 or 4. There are a lot of ways today to make that not be the case, to make your upfront investments really minimal, especially your cash investments, so that you can be profitable quick, within a few months of being in business. So I think about those very tangible, hard cost ways of trying to squeeze out an extra 2 to 4% in profitability to make sure, you can help yourself in this area while you're facing cost pressures in so many other areas.
Wow, good. And Jason, on your side, how can Shopware help brands maintain those healthy margins? What is that you can propose that?
Yeah, well, in North America, Shopware is being a bit of a disruptor in the way that we price our services. And it has everything to do with giving things like unlimited channels as part of our relationship. So in other words, spinning up other instances of Shopware and more sites doesn't cost you more. And it's a real efficiency gain for companies trying to go global. The second aspect is there's a lot of aspects of your business that you should pay a revenue share because your costs of the provider providing those services are variable and they fluctuate based on the usage of the software. So payments, fraud, tax, these are all things that are very variable in such a nature. And so is things like hosting. But the software itself shouldn't be, in my mind. And so look for commerce platforms that don't charge a revenue share on the software itself. I think that's a very big differentiator that Shopware is able to do and provide in this market. So that would be my answer. Look for partners who have unlimited channels that don't try to gouge you and nickel and dime you. And then we think a rev share is a tax on your growth.
Okay, that's super interesting, guys. We are in the minute 48, so we're going to leave a little bit of time for some questions that we got. Here we have first question. Says, hi, Jason. What does a realistic timeline look like if we migrate from another platform?
It's an excellent question. It's the question that we get asked every day by merchants. And the answer to it always varies based on the complexity. The range is probably on a modestly complex use case is probably 3 to 4 months. We've certainly done quicker. But if you're more complex, 6, 8 months is probably a realistic one. And just to be really clear, Shopware focuses on complex commerce. So use cases in regulated industries, businesses with huge catalogs, or in B2B, things like distributors who hate rev shares, frankly. And so we love complex use cases, which is why you hear days like that. If your business is a very simple business, largely domestic, apparel, footwear, health and beauty, simple commerce is best solved probably in this market by Shopify. And so this is a bit of a distinction as to where Shopware fits into the market. We know our ICP, and those are the complex use cases. Hopefully that answers your question, Carolyn. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jason. I have another question for you. Following up, you mentioned already during the conversation a few things about it, but what kind of implementation support does Shopware provide to, in terms of partners, solution architects, etc.?
Yeah. Well, there's two things that matter here, I think. The first is, there's 6 or 7 different ways for commerce platforms to monetize their business. Okay. The first is being great software, then hosting, then payments, then app store, then services, the list goes on. And Shopware has very much decided that we're going to make the lion's share of our money in being a great software product. And we're going to be open, and we're going to let everybody else make money in the value chain of providing commerce, because we think that's how it gets done best. So what we do when we launch customers is we support the agencies who do the build outs and the upgrades and the management of the relationship. And it goes well beyond commerce, right? These are the agencies who help with your ERP or your CRM or your marketing services and other things. So Shopware's job number one is get you live and stand behind the agencies who do the work. Number two, we've got a vibrant community. Hundreds of thousands of certified developers run Shopware. And so we provide what's called a community hub for any of our clients, partners, prospects, or even competitors can go into our community hub and interact with each other. And it's this place that supports learnings and certifications and best practice. And, I went global, who I use, that kind of communication. So it's pretty unique in the industry to have something along those lines. So those are really the two ways we support. We give you access to a world-class list of agencies to do the work. We support those agencies in your deployment. And secondarily, we give you a hub to interact with us. Finally, I guess last point is we do support for the application itself. So 24/7 access to Shopware people to help if there's issues related to the product itself. So there's a variety of ways we support our clients.
Okay. Good explanation. Thank you. One more question from Christian. What are the downsides of merchant of record, Dan?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's actually a handful of things that I would say brands should consider that could be downsides in going down this path. One I would say is, in my experience, like once you kind of go down the path of merchant of record, it is admittedly a little trickier to get off the path, right? And I'll give you an example. If you're a company who sells a B2B software subscription or a consumer software subscription, because of the way the model works, like there is some transactional interaction between us and your customer. And so actually moving off of that and into a different business model, it's not something you just do overnight, right? You wouldn't just go download a new app and swap that app in. You'd have to have a little bit of perspective on making that change. I usually tell brands, if you're going to go down the merchant of record path, you should have like at least a 1-year commitment to that strategy. You should see that as your path in this particular market for the next year, so that it's not just a decision you make on the whim and tomorrow you'd like to use a different point solution. So that's probably the first thing I would say. I wouldn't necessarily call this a downside per se, but it's kind of it comes up oftentimes in conversations with brands who are new to merchant of record. Sometimes there's the perception that because I'm using a merchant of record, I can completely wipe my hands clean of any and all tax obligations, and that's actually not the case. Like inside of Europe, just about everything has VAT on it. if it's a domestic transaction, even if you're making a B2B sale. And so there's still some elements of tax that you may have to comply with, even though you're using a merchant of record. It doesn't entirely go away, right? It just gets dramatically simpler than dealing with it at a bunch of scale to a bunch of end customers. So that's maybe the second thing I would say. And then I guess the last little thought here is, when you use a merchant of record, there is like a minimal amount of visibility you give your shopper to that merchant of record. And we always talk internally about having the least amount of footprint as we possibly can. But at the end of the day, to use this model, there is a little bit of disclosure you have to give to your customers in your terms of sale, if you want to think about it that way. And that's really what would enable us to be the party responsible for tax and other things we've talked about today. So sometimes that'll come up with brands as well. They'll say something like, well, I don't want my customer to have really any exposure to you. I don't want that to be something that they're aware of. And we always just try to coach people on that and help them understand that there's no branding, there's no interaction between us and your customer. You just have to meet the minimum legal requirements to actually use the business model. So I love that question. It's a really good one. We're not a perfect fit for everyone. Merchant of record isn't always the best option, but it can be a really good solution to move a lot faster.
All right. Thank you, Dan. So we are getting almost to the time. So just one last, let's say, closing question to you guys. In just a few words, what should brands start or stop doing when it comes to international expansion? Jason, do you want to start?
Well, I think number one, I think don't give up on the idea of the revenue growth is what fuels all brands. And so you have to find the most logical path to global expansion. And I think the thing they should start doing is opening their mind to multiple payment models to support it. And I think there's a really good place for merchant of record. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all model, which Dan did a great job articulating. But I think that brands should consider merchant of record to see if it helps them hit some of their long tail global expansion needs. That'd be the one thing they should start doing.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that. I would say, this is kind of a stop and start, but I would coach brands on taking bite-sized chunks in this global expansion path. I've seen a lot of brands who just want to add 200 plus countries and they try and tackle the whole thing at once. And there are technologies out there that make that more possible. But I don't often see that result in a lot of tangible success that you can learn from and repurpose for other markets. So I usually tell people, go after a few, maybe even just one initially, figure out the formula, be successful with it, and take that success and go apply it to a few more. Until you create enough momentum and enough critical mass that you can truly be a global brand. So that's what I would say if I was talking to someone who just wanted raw advice on how should I think about this.
All right. Well, I think the audience got a lot of great insights from you guys. I hope they learn a little bit more about what platforms use and what is a merchant of record and how to get the most out of it. Thank you for the audience for being here today, listening. Thank you, Jason and Dan. Great discussion, definitely. You will all receive a copy of the registration in your inbox. So if you need any more information, you want to organize a call, just reply to that email and we will set it up. Thank you all and have an amazing day and good selling and good end of the year for everyone.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jason, for joining.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, guys.
Yep. All right. Have a good day.